Before there were empires of men, there was one that belonged to the gods. Born from the river's edge, it did not seek to conquer the world, but to conquer time itself. For 3,000 years, its people built monuments that defied decay, spoke prayers that reached the stars, and carved their names in the language of eternity. But even eternity has its price. The kings who ruled as gods became dust. The temples fell silent beneath the sand. Yet the river still flows, and the gods still whisper. This is the story of ancient Egypt, the first empire of gods and men. Long before Rome dreamed of empire, before Greece spoke the language of reason, there was a kingdom that looked to the stars and saw gods looking back. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, where life was born each year from the flood of a sacred river. When the rest of the world still wandered in tribes, they built cities of stone, spoke with the voices of gods, and promised that death itself could be conquered. Across the endless sands of North Africa, the Nile carved a green path through desolation. Every sunrise over its waters was a rebirth. Every flood a reminder that eternity could be measured, not in years, but in seasons. To the farmers, it was mercy. To the priests, it was proof that heaven and earth were bound together. For 1,000 generations, they watched the river rise and fall. They marked its cycles with stars. They learned the secret of time itself. And in their language, time was not a straight line, but a circle. What had come before would come again. The same sun, the same flood, the same gods walking among men. But where there are gods, there are also kings. And in the valley of the Nile, men began to dream of becoming divine. Two lands rose, Upper Egypt in the south, where the river flowed swift and narrow between cliffs of stone, and Lower Egypt in the north, a vast delta that opened to the sea. Two worlds, two crowns, two peoples separated by distance and united only by ambition. For centuries, they lived in uneasy balance, trading, raiding, mirroring the duality that would come to define Egypt itself: life and death, chaos and order, red and white. And then came Narmer, a name half lost to time, but remembered in stone. More than 5,000 years ago, his armies marched from the south beneath the burning sun. His banners carried the white crown of Upper Egypt, his enemies the red crown of the north. When the dust settled, the world had changed. On a slab of polished stone, we see the moment, a figure larger than life, arm raised high, striking down his foe. It was not just an act of war. It was a sacred declaration. Two lands had become one. The red and the white crowns had merged upon a single head. And from that moment on, there would be one king, the Pharaoh, Lord of the two lands, the living bridge between gods and men. From that unification was born an idea unlike any other in human history, that power could be divine, and divinity could be built from stone. The Egyptians did not worship their kings out of fear. They believed them to be vessels of the gods, their voices carrying the will of heaven itself. When the Pharaoh spoke, the Nile obeyed, the crops grew, the stars kept their course. And when he died, he did not die at all. He merely returned to the sun, to rise again in another form. To live in Egypt was to live inside a miracle. To die was merely to continue it. Every temple, every pyramid, every hieroglyph carved into stone was a prayer against forgetting. A promise that the world of men could touch eternity. And so Egypt entered history not as a tribe or a kingdom, but as an idea that through faith, discipline, and divine order, humanity could become immortal. But immortality comes with a price. To hold eternity, one must never stop building. And for 3,000 years, the people of the Nile built ceaselessly. Cities, temples, empires, each greater than the last, until one day, the river that gave them life began to take it away. Empire's Historical welcomes you. This is the story of Egypt, the first empire of gods and men, its rise from the river's edge, its age of glory and power, and its long descent into sand and silence. Every empire dreams of eternity, but only one ever tried to build it. The Nile was not just a river, it was life itself. From the highlands of Africa, its waters traveled more than 4,000 miles, bringing with them the silt of distant lands, the black soil that turned desert into paradise. Each year, the flood returned like a heartbeat. The river rose, spilled across the fields, and when it retreated, it left behind a gift: fertility, order, renewal. To live beside the Nile was to understand eternity, not as a myth, but as a rhythm. Life, death, and rebirth. The pattern of the flood, the pattern of the gods. The people of early Egypt learned to watch the river's moods. They measured its height, its color, its timing. When the floods were too weak, famine followed. When they came too strong, villages vanished. Survival depended on balance, on harmony between man and nature, and between earth and heaven. And so the Egyptians gave the river a soul. They called him Hapi, the god of the flood, bringer of abundance. Each summer, they offered him bread and wine, thanking him for his mercy, fearing his silence. But the Nile was only part of the miracle. Along its banks rose small kingdoms, each ruled by a local chieftain, each guarding a stretch of river, each praying to its own gods. The north and the south, the red land and the black land. Two halves of a single body that had not yet learned to breathe together. Then came a time of unification, when men began to think not as tribes, but as a people. Trade bound them, belief united them. And the idea of kingship of Pharaohs, one ruler chosen by the gods, began to take hold. These early kings were both human and divine. They did not rule with iron, but with ritual. Their crowns, their staffs, their headdresses, all symbols of a sacred order that mirrored the heavens. From these beginnings rose the first great dynasty, and with it, the birth of the Egyptian state. The capital was at Thutmose, near the sacred city of Abydos, where the earliest pharaohs were laid to rest. Their tombs, simple mounds of mud brick, were the prototypes of pyramids yet to come. Each tomb was a bridge between worlds, a door for the king's soul to step through into eternity. The Egyptians believed that every being was made of many parts: the body, the ka, and the ba. The ka was the life force, the spark of divine energy within. The ba was the personality, the part of the soul that could travel between the worlds of the living and the dead. And when death came, the two would reunite in the afterlife, as long as the body remained preserved. Thus was born one of humanity's most enduring obsessions, the quest for immortality. To the Egyptians, death was not an end. It was a doorway, and every pharaoh, every priest, every common farmer believed that through proper ritual their soul could join the gods in the field of reeds, a paradise where the Nile flowed forever. As centuries passed, the tombs grew larger, the rituals more elaborate. Priests studied the stars. Scribes recorded hymns to guide the dead. The knowledge of the afterlife became a science of eternity. From this devotion came the first written texts of Egypt, the pyramid texts, carved inside the tombs of kings. Each spell was a map for the soul, a guide through the trials of the underworld. "Rise up, O Pharaoh," one of them declares. "Take your throne among the stars. The sky belongs to you. The earth has given you birth again." It was poetry, but also law. To live rightly in this world was to prepare for the next. And so Egypt's moral code, its concept of Ma'at, was born. Ma'at was more than justice. It was the balance of all things: truth, harmony, order. The universe itself was thought to survive only if Ma'at was upheld. The pharaoh's duty was not merely to rule, it was to preserve this divine order. Every offering, every judgment, every monument was an act of balance against chaos. And chaos had a name, Isfet, the darkness that waited beyond the edge of the world, the eternal enemy of creation. For the Egyptians, every sunrise was a victory. Ra, the sun god, sailing his bark across the sky, battling the serpent Apophis through the night to bring dawn once more. Their religion was not about fear, it was about participation. Every man and woman had a role to play in maintaining the order of the cosmos. When they sowed their fields, they honored Osiris, the god of death and rebirth. When they prayed for the flood, they called upon Hapi. When they watched the stars, they saw the journey of Ra himself. In this world, the sacred and the ordinary were one. To live was to worship, to farm was to pray, to build was to remember. And above it all, the pharaoh stood as the axis of existence, the living embodiment of Ma'at. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, Egypt had become something the world had never seen before. A civilization built on stability, faith, and time itself. While other peoples rose and fell, the Egyptians endured. The desert shielded them from invasion. The Nile sustained them with abundance, and their belief in eternal order gave them purpose through famine, flood, and death. They did not fear change. They transcended it. Every sunrise, every flood, every king was proof that the world could be reborn. The age of the first pharaohs had passed into legend, but from their tombs at Abydos, a new idea was stirring, that kingship itself could reach beyond death, that a monument could hold the soul forever. Soon, in the sands of the West, builders would raise mountains of stone. They would point them toward the sky and fill them with the promises of eternity. The age of the pyramids was about to begin. The world had never seen anything like it. In the heart of the desert, under a sun that burned without mercy, stone began to rise, slowly, deliberately, toward the heavens. Each block was a prayer, each angle a symbol. Together they formed a bridge between man and God. This was the Old Kingdom, the age of divine kings, the age of the pyramids. At the dawn of the 3rd millennium before Christ, Egypt stood at the height of its early power. The land was united, the harvests were rich, the gods were silent, which meant in Egyptian thought that the world was in balance. From the city of Memphis, the pharaoh ruled as both king and deity. His word was law, his breath the will of heaven. And yet, his people did not worship him out of fear. They saw in him the promise that order could last forever. The pharaoh's court was a world unto itself. Scribes recorded every grain of wheat, priests tended every flame, architects and engineers dreamed in stone. Their labor was not seen as servitude, but as participation in Ma'at, the divine balance of the universe. To build for the pharaoh was to build for eternity. The first of the great builders was Djoser. He ruled more than 4,500 years ago in the city of Memphis. But his true monument rose in the desert, a staircase to the sky. It began as a simple mastaba, a flat tomb of brick. Then came the vision of a genius, his architect, Imhotep. Imhotep was no ordinary man. He was a priest, a scholar, a physician, and above all, an architect who thought like a god. He saw the tomb not as a resting place, but as a ladder to eternity. Layer by layer, he built upward 6 steps of limestone reaching toward the sun. When it was done, the step pyramid of Saqqara stood nearly 200 feet tall, the first pyramid in human history. It was not yet the perfect form, but it was the beginning of an idea that would shape the ages. Stone had become immortal. The kings who followed Djoser sought to surpass him. Each built his own resting place, each greater than the last. The art of pyramid building became a science, geometry, astronomy, and faith intertwined. Then came a man whose name would echo for eternity, Khufu, known to the Greeks as Chaos. Khufu ruled Egypt during the 4th dynasty around 2550 BCE. Under his command, an army of builders began the greatest project the world had ever known, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rose from the plateau like the horizon itself, each side perfectly aligned to the cardinal points of the earth. 2.5 million blocks of stone, some weighing more than 15 tons, were hauled by hand, placed with a precision that still defies belief. For 20 years, the people labored under the desert sun. Not slaves, as later myth would claim, but workers, craftsmen, farmers who toiled during the flood season when the fields lay underwater. They worked for rations of bread and beer, and for something greater, a place in eternity. When it was finished, the Great Pyramid stood 480 feet tall, the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. It was a mountain of meaning. A tomb, yes, but also a symbol of creation itself, a reflection of the sacred mound that had risen from the primordial waters at the beginning of time. At its peak, a golden capstone caught the morning light, flashing like the sun god Ra himself. To see it from miles away was to see the proof that man could touch the divine. Khufu was followed by his son Khafra and his grandson Menkaura, each building his own pyramid beside the first, each smaller, each refined. Beside them stood the Sphinx, a creature of lion's body and human face, its gaze fixed forever on the rising sun. Its true purpose remains a mystery. Guardian of the necropolis, representation of the king as God, or perhaps a question carved in stone that the ages would never fully answer. For centuries, the pyramids of Giza stood as the axis of the world. Their temples thrived with offerings. Their priests performed endless rituals to sustain the pharaoh's soul in the afterlife. This was Egypt's golden age. Art flourished. Trade expanded from the Levant to Nubia. The pharaoh's ships sailed the Red Sea, bringing incense, gold, and exotic animals from the land of Punt. The people believed that as long as the pharaoh lived rightly, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and order would prevail. But time wears down even the hardest stone. As the dynasties passed, the cost of eternity began to break the living. Pyramids grew smaller. Resources stretched thin. Nobles gained power. Priests gained wealth. And the divine authority of the pharaoh began to waver. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the great age of the pyramid builders was ending. The last of them, Pharaoh Pepi II, ruled for more than 90 years. The longest reign in history. But his long twilight saw Egypt's unity unravel. Provincial governors, once loyal servants of the throne, became independent lords. The Nile failed, famine spread, and the voice of Ma'at fell silent. The people who had built mountains for the dead could no longer feed the living. And so the Old Kingdom, the first great chapter of Egypt's story. 2. The pyramids still stood, their peaks glowing in the sunset, but the kingdom they represented was broken. The gods had not abandoned Egypt, but they had gone quiet. And in that silence, chaos began to speak. The age of stone was over. A new era was dawning. An age of darkness, of division, and of rebirth. From the ruins of the Old Kingdom would rise the Middle Kingdom, a time when Egypt would rediscover itself and learn that true power comes not from monuments, but from memory. The Old Kingdom had fallen. Its kings lay entombed in their pyramids, their names fading from memory, their glory swallowed by the desert. The Nile still rose and fell, but Egypt no longer moved with it. The unity that had once defined the two lands was broken. Nomarchs, the provincial lords, ruled like kings in miniature, hoarding grain, raising armies, forgetting the pharaoh's name. It was a time of drought, of hunger, of silence. The people looked to the heavens and asked the question that every civilization must face. When the gods go quiet, what remains? For nearly 2 centuries, Egypt drifted in darkness. This was the first intermediate period, a time of fragmentation and fear. Tombs were plundered, cities turned inward. The great monuments of the past stood as reminders of what had been lost. Yet even in ruin, the Egyptian spirit endured. The priests still recited the old hymns, the scribes still copied the sacred texts, and along the Nile, men and women still waited for the flood that would save them. Then, in the southern city of Thebes, a new voice rose from the ashes. A line of rulers, humble at first, but driven by vision, began to rebuild what the north had forgotten. Their leader was Mentuhotep II, a warrior, a reformer, and above all a believer in order, Ma'at. He marched north against his rivals, uniting Egypt once more under a single crown. It was not the work of conquest alone, but of restoration. When Mentuhotep entered the ancient capital of Memphis, the people saw not a conqueror, but a pharaoh reborn. After more than a century of chaos, the 2 lands were whole again. The white crown of the south and the red crown of the north were joined upon one head, and Egypt, for the second time, was reborn. This was the Middle Kingdom, the Age of Renewal. It began around 2050 BCE under the 11th and 12th dynasties. The new pharaohs no longer built mountains of stone. Their monuments were humbler, but their reach was deeper. They sought not only to rule their people, but to understand them. In the Middle Kingdom, the idea of kingship changed. The pharaoh was still divine, but now he was also human, a shepherd, a servant of his people. This shift marked a profound transformation in Egyptian thought. The art of the period reflects it. Statues of kings no longer show perfect youthful faces. They show age, lines of worry, eyes heavy with responsibility. These were rulers who carried the weight of their nation as fathers carry their sons. The 12th dynasty built canals, expanded farmland, and reopened trade routes long abandoned. Grain filled the storehouses. Ships once again sailed to Punt and Byblos. The temples of Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, rose in splendor. Egypt had learned from its fall. Its rebirth was not of arrogance, but of wisdom. One pharaoh above all defined this age, Senusret. A warrior, a reformer, a legend. He fortified Egypt's southern border with massive fortresses, defending the Nile's cataracts from Nubian incursions. He led campaigns deep into Africa, not to conquer for glory, but to secure the lifeblood of Egypt, the trade of gold, ivory, and incense. To the people, he was more than a king. He was the bringer of balance. And in time, he was deified, worshipped as a god while still alive. Under his rule, justice was codified, officials were held accountable, and the poor were given voice through the pharaoh's decree. This was the Middle Kingdom's heart. Not power for power's sake, but order through compassion. In the temples of Thebes, priests began to compose new hymns. Prayers not just for kings, but for all souls. The good man, one hymn says, is he who feeds the hungry, who shelters the orphan, who speaks truth and does ma'at. He shall live forever in the field of reeds. For the first time, eternity was democratized, no longer reserved for pharaohs and nobles. The afterlife was open to anyone who lived justly. This was a revolution of the spirit. Egypt had found immortality not in stone, but in the human heart. Yet even golden ages fade. After centuries of prosperity, the power of the pharaohs waned once again. The Hyksos, foreign rulers from the north, entered the delta, bringing with them new weapons, new horses, and the chariot. Egypt, once the teacher of the world, became its pupil. But defeat does not always mean death. In the crucible of foreign rule, the Egyptians learned again to adapt. They absorbed the Hyksos' tools, their tactics, their innovations. And when the time came, they would use them to reclaim their destiny. The Middle Kingdom had been a time of reflection, a rebirth of faith and purpose. It proved that Egypt's power did not lie in conquest or monuments, but in its ability to endure. The Nile had flooded and receded as it always had. Empires had come and gone, but the Egyptians, they remained. For in the rhythm of the river, they had learned the rhythm of time itself. And though the tide was turning again, the spirit of Egypt would rise once more, stronger, wiser, and ready for empire. The storm had passed, the invaders were gone, and from the ashes of humiliation, Egypt rose again. The Hyksos were driven from the delta, their chariots captured, their weapons mastered. The kings of Thebes had learned their lesson. To survive, Egypt must not only defend itself, it must dominate. And so began a new era, the new kingdom, the age of empire, the age of the sun. At its dawn stood Thutmose I, the warrior king who reclaimed Egypt's crown. He rebuilt the nation from ruin, restored its temples, and reopened its borders. His victory marked not just liberation, but transformation. For the first time, Egypt looked beyond its frontiers, toward Nubia in the south, Canaan in the north, and the great empires that lay beyond the desert. The Nile Kingdom had become something greater, a power that would reach from the heart of Africa to the banks of the Euphrates. Under Thutmose IV, the empire expanded on a scale never before imagined. His armies marched through Nubia, their banners shining in the sun. They crossed the Sinai and stormed the cities of Syria. At the height of his conquests, Thutmose ordered a granite stele to be raised on the banks of the Euphrates River. It read, "The Pharaoh has stretched the boundaries of Egypt farther than the heavens." This was the beginning of Egypt's golden empire. When Thutmose I died, his bloodline produced one of the most extraordinary figures in human history. A woman who would rule as king, Hatshepsut. She was not merely regent, she was Pharaoh, the first great queen to wear the double crown. In her reign, Egypt turned from conquest to creation. The temples of Amun at Karnak rose to glory. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri was carved into the living cliffs of the West Bank. Terraces and colonnades aligned perfectly to the rising sun. She reopened trade with Punt, the land of incense and gold. Her ships sailed across the Red Sea, returning with myrrh trees and exotic animals. She ruled not through fear, but through faith and prosperity. And for 2 decades, Egypt knew peace. The kind of peace that allows art, science, and spirit to flourish. But history is not kind to peace. After her death, her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, erased her name from the monuments. Yet her legacy endured. In every pillar, every relief, every breath of the temples she built. Thutmose III was the warrior Hatshepsut never was. He transformed Egypt into the superpower of the ancient world. At the Battle of Megiddo, he led his armies through a narrow mountain pass, surprising a coalition of Canaanite kings. The enemy fled to their city, and for 7 months the Egyptians laid siege until victory was absolute. From that day forward, every pharaoh dreamed of Megiddo, the perfect triumph. Thutmose III brought home not only spoils and captives, but the knowledge and wealth of the world. He built obelisks that pierced the sky, temples that glowed with gold. His empire stretched farther than any Egyptian before him. He was the Napoleon of the Nile, but with the soul of a priest. After him came Amenhotep II, then Thutmose IV, and then a ruler whose vision would change Egypt forever, Amenhotep III, the dazzling sun. Under his reign, Egypt was at peace, rich beyond imagination. He built palaces of stone and lakes for his queen, Tiye. He raised statues 70 feet tall, the Colossi of Memnon, guardians of his mortuary temple. He expanded the great temple of Amun, and the city of Thebes became a capital of gods. It was a time when art reached perfection, when religion was pure, when Egypt believed itself eternal. But from the brilliance of the sun comes the danger of its shadow. When Amenhotep III died, his son took the throne, a dreamer, a poet, a prophet. His name was Amenhotep IV, but the world would know him as Akhenaten. He looked upon the pantheon of Egypt, the 1,000 gods, the endless rituals, and saw corruption. He declared there was but one God, Aten, the living sun. He built a new capital in the desert, Akhenaten, the horizon of the sun. There, under the open sky, he and his queen Nefertiti worshipped the light itself. Art changed. The pharaoh and his family were shown with tender faces, loving gestures, human flaws. Gone were the stiff forms of old. This was intimacy. This was revolution. But revolutions seldom survive their prophets. Akhenaten's obsession with his god neglected the empire. Enemies gathered at Egypt's borders. The priests of Amun seethed in silence. And when Akhenaten died, his son set with him. In the ruins of his faith rose a boy, a king of 9 years old, Tutankhamun. He restored the old gods, returned to Thebes, and brought Egypt back to balance. Though his reign was brief, his tomb would grant him immortality. When it was opened in 1922, 33 centuries later, its treasures revealed to the modern world the splendor of Egypt's golden age. But in his own time, Tutankhamun was a symbol, a fragile bridge between a broken past and the empire that would rise again. That empire reached its zenith under Ramses II, the Great, the Builder, the living god. He reigned for 66 years, fathered over 100 children, and left behind more monuments than any king before him. Ramesses built the great temples of Abu Simbel, their colossal statues carved into living rock, staring across the Nile into eternity. He raised the city of Ramesses, a capital of power and splendor. He fought the greatest battle of his age, the Battle of Kach against the Hittites, where thousands of chariots clashed in thunder and smoke. Though neither side triumphed, Ramesses claimed victory. His story carved upon the walls of temples across Egypt, and years later he signed the world's first peace treaty, a pact of honor with the Hittite king Hattusili III. In that treaty, two empires that had fought for dominance chose coexistence. It was the dawn of diplomacy. Under Ramesses, Egypt flourished, its borders secure, its temples radiant, its people prosperous. The pharaoh was not just a man, he was the sun itself. But even the brightest star must fade. When Ramesses died, his successors inherited an empire too vast, too proud, too dependent on one man's glory. The treasury emptied, foreign powers rose, and the once golden sun began to dim. For 2 centuries, Egypt had ruled the known world. Its kings had spoken as gods, its temples had touched the sky. But beneath the gold lay cracks, political, spiritual, and human. The new kingdom was Egypt's triumph and its turning point. The sun had reached its zenith. Now it began to fall. The sun that had once blazed over Egypt's empire now began to fade. The monuments still stood, the temples still gleamed in the desert light, but something within the kingdom had changed. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses the Great wore the crowns of their ancestors, but not their power. The age of gods and empire was ending. The age of men, fragile, fearful, and flawed, had begun. When Ramesses II died, he left behind not only monuments, but a legacy too immense to sustain. For more than 60 years, he had been Egypt. His death created a void that no successor could fill. His sons and grandsons divided the kingdom among themselves, each clinging to fragments of authority. The temples demanded tribute, the nobles demanded land, and the army, once Egypt's shield, became a shadow of its former strength. The treasury, drained by decades of building and war, lay empty. Foreign tribute dried up, and in the silence that followed, Egypt's gods began to grow quiet. To the north, new peoples moved across the seas, raiders, wanderers, and destroyers. The world called them the Sea Peoples. No one knew where they came from. Perhaps the Aegean, perhaps beyond. But they came in waves, burning cities, toppling kingdoms, leaving ruin in their wake. The Hittite Empire fell. The cities of Canaan burned. Even mighty Ugarit, the jewel of the Syrian coast, was reduced to ashes. Egypt stood alone against the storm. Ramses III, a distant successor of the great Ramesses, rose to meet the threat. He rebuilt Egypt's defenses, gathered his armies, and faced the invaders head-on. The battles raged across the delta. Chariots clashed. Arrows darkened the sky, and when the smoke cleared, Egypt had prevailed. The inscriptions on the walls of Medinet Habu boast of victory, of foreigners slain, of gods appeased. But the cost was immense. Ramses III had saved his kingdom, but not its soul. Behind the carved triumphs lay famine, corruption, and conspiracy. In his final years, the king was betrayed, murdered by his own household, victim of a harem plot. The gods had grown silent, and now, so too did the kings. What followed was confusion, a slow unraveling. The 20th dynasty collapsed into weakness. Priests of Amun at Thebes seized power in the south. Generals ruled the north from Tanis. Egypt was one nation in name, but two in truth, split between altar and sword. The pharaoh was no longer divine. He was negotiable. This was the third intermediate period, an age of borrowed crowns and fading faith. Foreign dynasties rose. First, the Libyans, then the Nubians from the south. Each claimed to restore the glory of old. Each wore the regalia of the pharaohs, but none could recapture the spirit of the empire. Even as Egypt rebuilt, its heart was elsewhere, in memory. The pyramids stood as ghosts, the hieroglyphs as prayers to gods who no longer answered. And yet, the people endured. They still tilled the fields, still offered bread and beer to the dead, still watched the Nile rise and fall, the one rhythm left unbroken. Then, around the 8th century BCE, a new power rose from the east. Assyria. Its kings were not priests, but conquerors. They came with iron weapons and cruel resolve. Cities burned, temples fell, and Egypt, at once a conqueror, became a prize. For the first time in centuries, foreign armies marched through the delta. The land of the gods became a battlefield, but Egypt, stubborn as stone, refused to die. Even in defeat, it reinvented itself. The Site dynasty, the 26th, brought a brief renaissance. Kings like Psamtik I revived the old glories of the past. They reopened the schools of scribes, restored the temples, and commissioned statues in the style of the ancients. It was a deliberate act of remembrance, a nation trying to remember how to be eternal. For a moment, it worked. Trade returned. The Nile prospered, and once again, the pharaoh's image was carved in shining stone. But time, as always, was waiting. To the east, a new power stirred, Persia. Under Cambyses II, the Persian Empire swept across the known world, from the Indus to the Mediterranean. In 525 BCE, they crossed into Egypt. The last native pharaoh, Psamtik III, stood against them at Pelusium. He fought bravely, but the Persians were relentless. When the dust settled, Egypt, the oldest kingdom on earth, had fallen. For the first time in its 3,000 years, it was ruled by foreigners. Under the Persians, Egypt became a province, a satrapy of empire. Its gods were tolerated, its people taxed. The pharaoh's throne, once the seat of divine kingship, was now a chair beneath a foreign crown. And yet, even here, the Egyptian spirit endured. The temples continued their rituals. The scribes copied the ancient texts. The priests still invoked the names of Osiris and Isis. They had seen conquerors come and go before. They would outlast these as well. Centuries passed. The Persians fell to Alexander the Great, whose armies swept through the sands like wind. When he entered Egypt in 332 BCE, the people welcomed him as liberator. He journeyed to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where priests declared him son of the god. The Macedonian conqueror smiled. He understood the power of Egyptian belief. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took Egypt as his share of the empire. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek in blood, but Egyptian in spirit. They built libraries, temples, and cities, the greatest of them, Alexandria. There, the wisdom of the ancient world was gathered into scrolls and studied by scholars. It was Egypt's last renaissance, a kingdom of light in an age of empires. But even light fades. Rome rose. The Mediterranean became its lake, and Egypt, rich and beautiful, became its jewel. When Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, stood before Caesar and later Mark Antony, she was more than a queen. She was Egypt itself, graceful, intelligent, a living echo of the divine. Her death in 30 BCE marked the true end of ancient Egypt. The temples fell silent. The old gods faded into myth. The language of the pharaohs was forgotten. The Nile still flowed, but no one called its flood divine anymore. For 3,000 years, Egypt had lived by a single truth, that the world was order, and order could last forever. But nothing lasts forever. Empires rise, empires fall, even those blessed by the gods. Yet the Egyptians left behind something no conqueror could destroy: memory, stone, sand, and story. A civilization that refused to vanish. And though the gods fell silent, their silence still speaks. In the wind over Giza, in the shimmer of the Nile at dawn, in the echo of prayers carved into walls older than history, the sands of time swallowed the empire. The temples fell to dust, the statues broke, and the language of the pharaohs faded from living memory. But Egypt never truly died. Its body was buried beneath the desert, but its spirit, its story, its memory was eternal. For centuries after Cleopatra's death, the world looked upon Egypt with awe and mystery. The Greeks marveled at its wisdom. The Romans plundered its treasures, and travelers who walked among the ruins of Thebes and Memphis spoke of giants and forgotten gods. They could not read the words carved into the walls, but they felt their weight. The silence of Egypt was louder than any empire's voice. Time passed. Empires rose and fell: Rome, Byzantium, Arabia. But Egypt remained, its monuments standing like memories carved into the bones of the earth. The pyramids became symbols of endurance. The Nile, the eternal river, continued to flow, as if defying death itself. The people who lived along its banks no longer called their rulers pharaohs, but they still followed the same rhythm: planting, harvesting, living by the flood. Life in Egypt changed, yet somehow it never truly did. Then, in the Age of Rediscovery, the West awoke to Egypt once more. In 1799, a group of French soldiers under Napoleon unearthed a slab of black stone near the town of Rosetta. It bore 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and a strange, sacred writing. That stone would become the Rosetta Stone, the key to unlocking a lost world. For centuries, hieroglyphs had been silent, their meaning unknown. But in 1822, a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion cracked the code. The voices of the ancients spoke again. From that moment, the dead began to speak. Priests, scribes, kings, all whispering across 3,000 years. Egypt was reborn, not as a kingdom, but as a story. Archaeologists came by the hundreds, pioneers and dreamers. They uncovered tombs, palaces, and cities buried in the sand. In 1922, Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun, a door sealed for over 3 millennia. Inside lay the golden face of the boy king, shining like the sun of Ra. For the modern world, it was as if time itself had been broken open. Egypt was no longer legend. It was alive again. Today, we walk through its ruins with reverence. The colossal statues of Abu Simbel still stare across the desert, their gaze unbroken by time. The temples of Luxor and Karnak still echo with footsteps and whispers. The pyramids, those impossible mountains of stone, still stand beneath the same stars that watched over Khufu and Ramses. 5,000 years have passed, and yet they endure. But the legacy of Egypt is not just in stone. It is in the ideas it gave the world. The Egyptians were the first to imagine eternity, not as a dream, but as a system, a science. They measured time in cycles, life in order, death in renewal. They invented calendars, medicine, architecture, and the art of writing itself. Every civilization that came after borrowed something from the Nile. From their laws came justice. From their temples came geometry. From their myths came meaning. Egypt taught the world that civilization is not just about power, but about harmony. In every age since, when humanity looks back at the ruins of its own empires, it finds Egypt waiting, ancient, silent, watchful. The pharaohs may be gone, but their question remains. Can order outlast chaos? Can truth outlive time? The answer lies in the sand, in the sunlight over the Nile, in the unbroken line between past and present. Egypt reminds us that greatness is not measured in conquest, but in endurance. Not in noise, but in silence. Not in life, but in memory. And perhaps that is why Egypt still holds us. Because it is not simply ancient, it is eternal. Every column, every carving, every grain of sand is part of a single sentence written across the face of time. We were here. We built. We believed. We remembered. And through us, humanity's endless fascination, its study, its awe, they still are. As the sun rises over the Nile once more, its light touches the ruins of Karnak, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, and the stones of Giza. For a brief, golden moment, it is as if time stands still and Egypt breathes again. The gods may have fallen silent, but their echo remains, woven into the wind, carried by the river, and remembered by time itself. The empire of the Pharaohs had fallen silent. Persian kings ruled from distant capitals, and Egypt, once the heart of the world, had become a province of another's empire. But the sands of time never rest, and from beyond the horizon, a new storm was rising. It came not from the desert, nor from the south, but from the rocky hills of a land far to the north, a land called Macedonia. And at its head rode a young man who dreamed of eternity, Alexander. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, he came not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persians had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, their satraps taking tribute and taxing temples. To the Egyptian people, the foreign kings had been strangers to their gods. So when the Macedonian army crossed the Nile Delta, the people opened their gates. They welcomed him with garlands and incense, calling him Son of the Sun. Alexander understood symbols. He knew that in Egypt, power was not taken by force, it was given by faith. He traveled deep into the western desert, to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa, a sanctuary hidden among shifting sands. There, the priests greeted him as they had once greeted pharaohs. They told him he was the son of Amun, the god of kings. Alexander did not deny it. He bowed his head, and in that moment, the divine crown of Egypt passed from the blood of pharaohs to the line of Macedon. From that desert pilgrimage, a new Egypt was born. Alexander founded a city on the shores of the Mediterranean. City that fra priera mirror and against has says Nanzame Alexandria. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Here, Greek marble met Egyptian stone. Temples stood beside theaters, and rising above it all, a lighthouse so tall it touched the clouds, the Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Alexandria was a promise, a meeting of worlds, a bridge between the Nile and the Aegean, between gods and reason, between eternity and change. When Alexander died in Babylon at just 32, his empire fractured. His generals divided the world among themselves. Egypt fell to one of them, Ptolemy, his friend, his historian, and his fellow dreamer. Ptolemy crowned himself pharaoh, but unlike the conquerors who came before him, he did not try to erase Egypt's soul. He embraced it. He rebuilt temples, spoke to priests in their own tongue, and let the people keep their gods. He ruled not as a foreigner, but as a pharaoh reborn. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek kings who would reign for nearly 3 centuries, Greek in blood, but Egyptian in heart. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the beating heart of the Mediterranean. Ships came from every horizon: Rome, Carthage, India. Its harbors filled with spice, papyrus, gold, and knowledge. For within its walls stood a temple unlike any other, the Library of Alexandria. There, scribes collected every scroll, every record, every fragment of wisdom humanity had ever written. It was said that no ship could dock in Alexandria without surrendering its books to be copied. Mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers gathered here. Windy. Gladwatore, Eratosthenes, Herophilus, men who measured the earth, mapped the stars, and dissected the human soul. And for the first time in history, Pharaoh's knowledge itself became sacred. The torch of Egypt had passed from the temple altar to the scholar's lamp. Yet even in this new age of reason, the old gods lingered. In Thebes, Memphis, and Philae, the priests still sang hymns to Isis and Osiris. In the desert sanctuaries, pilgrims still left offerings of bread and oil. The Greeks had brought philosophy, but the Egyptians had given them immortality. Their myths began to blend. Zeus became one with a moon, Isis with Aphrodite, Osiris with Dionysus. And in that union, a new religion began to take shape, a promise of resurrection that would echo even into Christianity itself. The Nile had not been conquered, it had converted the conquerors. But beneath the splendor, the dynasty began to decay. Generations of inbreeding, court intrigue, and civil war weakened the Ptolemies. Their kings fought not enemies, but each other. Their people suffered, and their treasury drained. In their desperation, they turned to a rising power from the west, a republic whose legions were marching across the world, Rome. Egypt's golden age under Greece was drawing to an end, but it would end not with a collapse, nor with a battle lost in the sand, but with a woman, a queen, a symbol. The last breath of the ancient world, her name would outlive them all, Cleopatra. The sun was setting on Egypt, not just the day, but the dynasty of the Pharaohs itself. The once mighty land of the Nile, where gods had walked among men, now bowed beneath the shadow of empires. Persia had come and gone, Greece had come and gone. And now, from the west, a new power rose. Rome. The world was changing, and at its heart stood one woman, the last to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra, and she would become legend. When Cleopatra VII took the throne in 51 BCE, Egypt was already on the edge of ruin. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long since decayed, a tangle of assassinations, debts, and endless struggle for power. Her father, Ptolemy the Fiend, had bought the favor of Rome with gold. Her siblings plotted behind palace walls, and the Nile itself, lifeblood of Egypt, was faltering under drought and corruption. Cleopatra was only 18, young, brilliant, and utterly alone. But she was no ordinary queen. She spoke 9 languages. She studied mathematics, philosophy, and politics. She understood that in a world ruled by men, words were as sharp as swords. And so she began to play the greatest game of her time, a game of empires. At first, she was exiled, driven out by her own brother, Ptolemy III, and his ambitious regents. She fled to Syria, gathered an army, and waited for a chance to return. That chance came not from the gods, but from Rome. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival, Pompey the Great. Pompey sought refuge with the boy king Ptolemy, but the Egyptians, hoping to please Caesar, betrayed him. They murdered Pompey on the shore and presented his severed head to Caesar. Caesar was horrified, and into that moment of chaos stepped Cleopatra. According to legend, she entered Caesar's chambers wrapped inside a carpet. When the cloth unfurled before him, the young queen emerged, not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. Her wit, her charm, her intelligence captivated the Roman general. She spoke to him not of love, but of legacy, of how Egypt, the oldest kingdom on earth, could once again be great if guided by strength and wisdom. Caesar was intrigued. He sided with her, and in a war that set Alexandria aflame, Cleopatra reclaimed her throne. In 47 BCE, she bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar. To the Egyptians, he was the heir of two worlds, child of Isis and Jupiter, Pharaoh and divine prince. But in Rome, Cleopatra was seen as dangerous, a sorceress, a temptress who had ensnared their beloved general. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the dream of empire died with him. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, her son in her arms, knowing the storm had only begun. Rome descended into chaos. Its greatest men, Octavian and Mark Antony, fought for control of the Republic. Cleopatra watched, waiting once more for her moment. That moment came when Antony summoned her to Tarsus. He wished to question her loyalty, but Cleopatra knew how to turn accusation into a lure. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a barge of gold and purple silk. Perfume filled the air. Musicians played flutes and harps. She reclined beneath a canopy dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants waving peacock fans. When Antony saw her, he was undone. He called her not queen, but divinity. And in that instant, Egypt once again ruled the heart of Rome. Together, they became myth. Antony and Cleopatra, the lovers who defied the world. He wintered with her in Alexandria, while Rome whispered of betrayal. He gave her kingdoms, Cyprus, Phoenicia, parts of Syria, and crowned Caesarion as King of Kings. To the Egyptians, it was rebirth. To Rome, it was blasphemy. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, declared Antony had fallen under foreign magic, that Cleopatra sought to make Rome a province of Egypt. The Senate rallied to him. The legions marched. The age of pharaohs would end not in famine or fire, but in war. In 31 BCE, at Actium, on the western coast of Greece, the two greatest fleets of the ancient world clashed. Cleopatra's ships, adorned with golden prows, glimmered beneath the Mediterranean sun. Antony's men fought fiercely, but Octavian's navy, led by Agrippa, cut off their supply lines. When the tide turned, Cleopatra ordered retreat. Antony followed her, not as general, but as man undone by love. The battle was lost. The empire of Egypt, thousands of years old, was doomed. They fled to Alexandria, their last sanctuary. As Roman legions closed in, Antony, hearing false news that Cleopatra had died, fell upon his sword. Bleeding, he was carried to her mausoleum, where she held him as he died. According to Plutarch, his final words were, "Do not grieve, my queen. Remember me, and live." Days later, Octavian entered the city victorious. He found Cleopatra in her chamber, robed in gold, a serpent at her breast. She had chosen her end. The asp, sacred to Isis, delivered the kiss of death, a queen's final act of defiance. In dying, Cleopatra denied Rome its triumph She would not be paraded through its streets as a captive. She would remain, forever, a pharaoh. With her death in 30 BCE, 3,000 years of divine kingship ended. The temples fell silent. The crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt were taken to Rome. The Nile, eternal, unbroken, flowed on, but the gods no longer spoke. Egypt was no longer the ruler of empires. It had become their memory. Yet Cleopatra's legacy endured. For centuries, she was remembered not as victim, but as vision. A woman who dared to rule in a world of men, who loved fiercely, who died on her own terms. In marble, in poetry, in film, her story became eternal. The Greeks gave her beauty. The Romans gave her tragedy. The world gave her immortality. And through her, Egypt lived again. When night falls over the ruins of Alexandria and the sea wind whispers through its broken stones, it is said her spirit still lingers not as ghost, but as memory. The last pharaoh, the last flame of an ancient sun. Cleopatra, the woman who outlasted time. The last cry of Egypt faded with Cleopatra. Her tomb was sealed, her city burned, and the double crown of the pharaohs was carried away to Rome. The Nile still flowed, but its people no longer called upon the gods of the sun or the dead. Temples turned to ruins. Priests vanished into legend. The gods of Egypt fell silent. A world that had once built eternity now belonged to time. When the Roman legions marched through Alexandria, they brought more than conquest. They brought forgetting. Egypt became a province, its wealth feeding the empire that had devoured it. The marble of Rome was built with Egyptian grain, its palaces lit by the oil of the Nile. In the markets of the empire, statues of Isis and Osiris stood beside those of Jupiter and Venus. The gods of Egypt were not destroyed. They were diluted. Their names whispered in foreign tongues. The Romans admired Egypt's glory, but they no longer understood its soul. For centuries, the land endured under new masters. Roman governors replaced pharaohs. Then came the Byzantines, bearing the cross instead of the ankh. The temples that had once echoed with hymns to Ra now became churches of Christ. The last hieroglyphs were carved not by kings, but by desperate scribes clinging to dying traditions. In 394 CE, on the island of Philae, a priest of Isis chiseled the final known hieroglyphic inscription. It was a prayer, a plea for remembrance. Then, silence. For the first time in 5,000 years, no one in Egypt could read the language of its own ancestors. The centuries passed like drifting sand. The Arabs came in the 7th century, their banners green beneath the desert sun. They called the land Mizr, Egypt, and the great river Al-Nil. They brought a new faith, a new tongue, and a new rhythm of life. The pyramids, once sacred mountains of the gods, became mysteries of the past. Travelers gazed at them with awe and fear, wondering who could have built such giants. In the markets of Cairo, peasants told stories that the pyramids were granaries of Joseph, built by prophets or relics of demons before the flood. History had turned to myth. The true Egypt, the Egypt of Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramses, was buried beneath the sands, its language dead, its stories forgotten. And yet, not entirely. Even in ruin, Egypt's shadow stretched across the world. Greek philosophers still studied her geometry. Roman architects still copied her columns. And in distant lands, dreamers still spoke of her magic. The land where men became gods, and gods became men. The Middle Ages gave birth to wonder and fear. Alchemists searched Egyptian ruins for secrets of immortality. Monks in Europe wrote of Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical sage they believed had ruled in ancient Egypt, a fusion of Thoth and Mercury. Egypt was no longer history. It had become myth itself, a symbol of lost knowledge, of forbidden power, of eternity. In time, the sands themselves became guardians. They swallowed temples and cities, preserving them like mummies wrapped in gold. The desert was cruel, but it was also kind. It sealed Egypt's memory from the world, waiting for someone to remember. For more than 1,000 years, no human soul could read a hieroglyph, speak a prayer to Amun, or name the kings who built the pyramids. But the gods were patient. They waited, because history always waits. And then, after nearly 2,000 years of silence, the winds began to shift once more. Europe awoke from its dark age, and eyes turned again toward the east. Explorers, scholars, and dreamers began to cross the Mediterranean, drawn by whispers of a land older than time. They stood before the Great Pyramid and felt the weight of eternity pressing down on them. They saw statues half buried in sand, faces eroded yet immortal. They dug, they measured, they guessed, but they did not yet understand. Because Egypt would reveal her secrets only to those who truly listened. By the 18th century, the fascination became obsession. Napoleon Bonaparte, in his quest for empire, brought with him not only soldiers, but scientists, artists, and historians. His invasion of Egypt in 1798 was more than conquest. It was rediscovery. They mapped the land, measured the monuments, and recorded every symbol they saw. From their work came a massive tome, Description de l'Égypte, the book that reintroduced the ancient world to modern eyes. But even then, the true voice of Egypt remained silent. No one could read her words. Until one day in 1799, a soldier near the town of Rosetta uncovered a black stone covered in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, the Rosetta Stone. It would take 20 years and the genius of a young French scholar, Jean-François Champollion, to break its code. In 1822, he stood before the French Academy and read aloud for the first time in 2 millennia the words of the Pharaohs. "The gods live again," he whispered. And so they did. The silence was broken. From that moment, Egypt rose once more, not as a kingdom, but as a memory reborn. Temples were unearthed, tombs opened, names forgotten since the Bronze Age were spoken again beneath the desert sun. Ramses, Thutmose, Nefertiti, Akhenaten, Cleopatra. The old world stirred and humanity rediscovered its first civilization. For 3,000 years, Egypt had ruled the world through might. For another 2,000, it ruled through mystery. And now, it ruled through wonder. The empire of the Pharaohs was gone, but the idea of Egypt, eternal, divine, unyielding, had become immortal. Every column, every hieroglyph, every grain of sand was a heartbeat of that undying past. When you stand before the pyramids today, you are not looking at ruins. You are looking at memory-made stone. The wind that brushes your face once carried the prayers of kings. The stars that shine above Giza are the same stars that guided the builders of eternity. Egypt may have fallen, but she was never defeated. She sleeps and she dreams. And sometimes, when the desert wind is still, you can almost hear her whisper, "I am not gone. I am the beginning and the end." For nearly 2,000 years, Egypt had been silent. Its gods were buried, its temples forgotten, its kings reduced to myth. But the sands never forget. They only wait. And in the 19th century, after the long night of history, Egypt began to speak again. It started with curiosity and conquest. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought not just an army, but a generation of thinkers, engineers, artists, linguists, dreamers. While his soldiers fought beneath the shadow of the pyramids, his scholars mapped every ruin, measured every column, and copied every symbol they could find. They were awestruck. Even in ruin, Egypt dwarfed everything Europe had ever known. Their work became a monument of its own, the Description de l'Égypte, a 23-volume masterpiece that reawakened the Western world's obsession with antiquity. But Egypt still held her secrets. Her language remained locked in stone. The world could see her greatness, but not hear her voice. That would change in 1799. Near a small town called Rosetta, a French soldier uncovered a black slab of basalt covered in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. It was the key. But no one yet knew how to use it. For years, the world's greatest minds tried and failed. Some thought hieroglyphs were pure art, symbols of mysticism with no real grammar. Others insisted they were letters, a code just waiting to be broken. And then, in 1822, a young French linguist named Jean-François Champollion made the leap that no one else dared. He realized the hieroglyphs were not one language, but many, part picture, part sound, part sacred symbol. And then, one day, as he compared the Rosetta Stone to royal names written in Greek, he found the key, the name Ptolemy. From there, the code unraveled. On a September morning, Champollion burst into his brother's office, his face pale with revelation. He shouted, "I've got it! I can read the Pharaohs!" Then he collapsed from exhaustion. When he awoke, Egypt was alive again. Through his work, the words of Ramses, Thutmose, and Nefertiti spoke once more. For the first time in 2,000 years, humanity could read the thoughts of its oldest ancestors. It was as if a civilization had been resurrected, not from tombs, but from language itself. The gods were speaking again, and the world listened. The 19th century became an age of rediscovery. Archaeologists, explorers, and treasure hunters flocked to the Nile. Some came for glory, others for gold, and a few for truth. Among them was a British adventurer named Giovanni Belzoni, a former circus strongman who dug through the Valley of the Kings with bare hands and dynamite. He uncovered temples, tombs, and statues that had not seen the sun in 3 millennia. His methods were crude, but his passion was real. The world could not look away. Museums filled with sarcophagi, obelisks, and mummies. Egypt had become the stage upon which the modern age rediscovered its soul. Yet amid the chaos of discovery, one name would echo above all others: Howard Carter. He was not a nobleman or a scholar. He was an artist, a man who loved the colors and shapes of ancient walls. For decades, he toiled in the desert, believing that one last secret lay hidden: the tomb of a forgotten king. The Valley of the Kings had already been plundered 100 times. Most experts said there was nothing left to find, but Carter refused to believe it. Then, in November 1922, his workers uncovered a step carved into the bedrock. Then another, and another. A sealed doorway appeared, bearing the name Tutankhamun, the boy king. The air itself seemed to tremble. When Carter finally broke through the entrance, his patron, Lord Carnarvon, asked from behind, "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply became immortal. Yes. Wonderful things. By the light of a single candle, they saw golden statues, jewels, chariots, and the unbroken coffin of the young pharaoh, untouched for more than 3,000 years. The tomb was small, but its perfection changed history. It was proof that Egypt had never truly died, that behind the silence, the past had been waiting, perfectly preserved. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb ignited the modern world's obsession with Egyptology. The 1920s became an age of Egyptomania. Fashion, art, and architecture across Europe and America echoed the motifs of the Nile: lotus flowers, scarabs, pyramids, and eyes of Horus. Even Hollywood bowed to the ancient gods. The image of the mummy, the curse, and the eternal queen entered modern myth. Egypt had returned to not as empire, but sakes. Our Pharaohs for our later. Yet behind all the gold and glory lay a deeper revelation. The rediscovery of Egypt was not just about artifacts, it was about identity, about humanity's first mirror. In her temples and tombs, we saw the reflection of ourselves, our dreams of eternity, our fear of death, our desire to be remembered. Egypt was never simply ancient, she was timeless. And in rediscovering her, we rediscovered what it means to be human. Today, the sands of the Nile still shift, revealing new secrets with every generation. Archaeologists continue to uncover tombs, statues, and mummies. Each find whispers the same truth. History never dies. It only waits. The voices of the pharaohs still echo in museums, in papyrus scrolls, in the hearts of those who dare to listen. Egypt's empire may have fallen, but her story endures. It is written not only in stone, but in the imagination of all who seek wonder. From the union of Upper and Lower Egypt under Narmer, to the fall of Cleopatra, to the rediscovery beneath the sands, the arc of her story is not tragedy. It is resurrection. For no civilization that gave birth to eternity can ever truly die.